Sanbonani Hemahausit, and welcome to the Big Daddy Liberty Show, the podcast edition, which is, of course, syndicated on Chai FM. Welcome to the show, guys. It is a fantastic Friday morning. It is Erev Shabbat. And I'm hoping some of you guys are running around in preparation for the day of rest. Guys, welcome to the show as we just work out the kinks of that feedback. It will disappear in a moment. My name is Big Daddy Liberty, and you are, of course, on the BDL show. Remember, the show always begins by having a conversation of what are the big news items in the week? What got us talking? What got us chatting? What got us angry? Maybe what got us sad? We'll look at those issues, of course, after the first break. And today I have a very special guest, someone who I think, if you are a reader of the Daily Friend news site, that's www.dailyfriend.co.za, someone who you might actually are quite aware of. I'm talking, of course, about Mr. Terence Corrigan. He is the project manager at the Institute of Race Relations, and he wrote a very interesting piece this week, which brought to the fore, I think, a news item that had disappeared a little bit, sort of buried by the preoccupation of COVID-19. And he raised a piece about the spectre that is now being brought back onto the table of expropriation without compensation. And in this piece, he made some important arguments around property rights. So we're going to have that conversation as the main interview segment. That's after 20 minutes past 9. And as I said, guys, a very, very interesting news week that we've had. And of course, on the show, we always end it off by anticipating what the news week ahead might look like. And of course, what has become a tradition on the Big Daddy Liberty Show, the podcast, we look at who the MOEMISH of the week is. Who had the loser play or the loser action of the week, the MOEMISH of the week. So you can look forward to that at the end of the show. So let me take my first ad break, and after the break, we'll have a discussion around what made the news week this past week. You're back on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Man, oh man, has it not been an interesting week when you look at some of the issues that have dominated the news cycle. Some of them are a bit more recent, and I'm going to begin, as you heard maybe in the news segment just before the BDL show, the 10 million rand scooter ambulance flop that the Eastern Cape Education Department has basically embarked on. I mean, any sane South African who saw that when there's a whole bunch of pomp and ceremony at the launch of this thing could literally see that this was a non-starter. The idea that you can have, in a country like ours, by the way, we've often got to remind ourselves that South Africa is not a poor country. We really aren't. Insofar as the resources that this government takes in by way of taxes, it should, if we had a clean and proper administration, be able to provide world-class services, including, in this instance, on EMS, emergency medical services. I mean, if you can have a community-based initiative like Hatsola, for example, run a world-class service, why should we not expect the same level of quality, the same level of 21st century equipment and safe equipment being used by the state? I mean, it didn't make sense. Why are we resorting to using scooters as a means of transporting and ferrying patients? It really didn't make sense. And for anybody who was watching that launch would have just looked at this and sort of sighed because you could see that this was an absolute non-starter. Even though the Minister of Health, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, at the time was lauding this as fantastic because these scooters, he said, could make it into the rural areas and expand the primary healthcare network. We ask ourselves the questions, is this really the best means of doing that? So now we hear that the 10.1 million rand contract involved the procurement of essentially 100 scooters, and each of these scooters cost 94,000 rand, and they came with a 6,000 rand maintenance bill to them. It just didn't make sense. So again, another another example rather of the state embarking on fruitless, in my view, at least fruitless expenditure. Like you could have spent that kind of money actually buying proper ambulances that are well kitted out, or even training more EMS staff and hiring more EMS staff, which are critically needed in some parts of the country where there's a shortage of this kind of thing. So again, this whole thing is just shrouded in incompetence, and at some point we need to, as citizens, say, we need to draw the line and say, come on, this cannot continue. You cannot continue wasting resources that are sorely needed by mostly poorer South Africans in this country, as was the case here. But let me move on to, I suppose, the major news item that still dominates the headlines to a large extent, and that's COVID-19. South Africa has seen its cases climb to 238,000 or just over 238,000 cases, basically, with more than 13,000 new cases just in the last 24 hours. Now, if you listen to the mainstream punditry around this, people will posit this as like a scary thing, oh my goodness, we need to panic about this. And I'm like, no, actually, no. Surely this is exactly what we were told from the very beginning would likely happen. If you have a highly contagious respiratory type disease, akin to a flu in terms of its spread, how it spreads, that is, and what it affects, the lungs, and akin to something like even tuberculosis in terms of it being a respiratory type disease, then surely it stands to reason that it will spread quite rapidly. And, we were told, of course, by the state and all the experts that, the lockdown was in preparation of the state, at least, preparing itself to be able to deal with the inevitable rise in cases. So to me, it stands to reason that this is what would happen. And if we're saying the vast majority of people who get this, have mostly mild symptoms, and the vast majority of people recover from this, then it stands to reason that we will see these sort of numbers. And I don't think we need to panic, which brings me to, I think, a massive news item this week, which, in my opinion, sought to do nothing else other than to sow panic, whether intentionally or unintentionally. You guys would have read, of course, that the Gauteng provincial government, through its health MEC, that's a one Andile Masuku, in comments to the press this week, basically said, that the provincial government was digging 1.5 million graves for this virus. Why would you say that? I just don't understand why you would say that. When, as things stand in this country, the death toll in South Africa nationally is only 3,720, and it's nowhere near, it'll be nowhere near, reaching a figure like 1 point something million people. And then again, let me add more context to this, because people say, oh, you're just trying to, downplay the seriousness of this. Yes, absolutely, it is a very serious thing, but facts matter. Data matters. Globally, that's the entire world, only about 550,000 people have died from this. So on what basis would the Gauteng provincial government assert that it needs to prepare the likelihood or the possibility of as much as 1.5 million grave sites? That's nearly 10% of the Gauteng population. I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong with the way in which we're communicating this pandemic to people. We're alarming and we're scaring people, as opposed to arming citizens with good data, with good facts, and of course context, which is incredibly important, so that people can actually make decisions around this. Because you now have a situation where there are political opportunists who are climbing into this issue and sowing panic on one or other issues that are related to COVID. And I must segue to the next issue, which was the politics of now the school reopening. It's become an absolute political playing ball, where opposition parties and some formations, even within the ANC, are forming ranks to basically scaremonger to a large extent. I mean, the issue, an issue should have been left to what is, or rather, an issue that should have been left to what the scientific literature tells us, has now been pounced upon by politicians. I mean, on the science of it, someone like the basic education minister, that's Angie Motshekga, is actually right in reopening schools. She's absolutely, in terms of what the science says, she's absolutely right to say, schools should open. Why? Because children are of low risk, we now see this, and with the appropriate knowledge and precautions, they are not spreaders of the COVID virus. And in reality, kids and children will be fine. excuse me, children will be fine. Yet you now have the likes, because this is being turned into politics, you have the likes of the EFF, pockets of our own party, the ANC, that's specifically the ANC Women's League, and the military, the Mkhontosis, or Military Veterans Association, and the former leader of the DA, that's Musi Maimane, who now leads the upstart, One Direction. Excuse me, I meant he leads the One SA movement, rather. They're all describing essentially sending children to school as some sort of death sentence, and it's absolute hyperbole. It's absolutely unnecessary. It is scaring parents who right now, rightly so of course, are worried, but should be assured, based on what the evidence tells us, what the data tells us, what the science tells us, that actually their children will be fine, as long as there are good precautions in place. And it seems to me, maybe as a last thought before I go to my break, that the courts get it. The courts, when they're presented with the evidence, by and large, and when they're presented with the data, they get it. Because recently, as a last issue, the North Gauteng High Court on Monday ordered that all private preschools may actually open immediately. They may open immediately. This is, of course, Judge Hans Fabricius. I hope you remember him. He was involved in the Collins Causa case. Ordered that all private preschool institutions offering early childhood development services, that's grade R and lower, are actually entitled to reopen immediately. This is a case that was brought by the trade union Solidarity's Occupational Guild for Social Workers and their School Support Center against the Department of Social Development regarding the opening and the reopening, rather, of private nursery schools. Which for me, this judgment was important because it brings the facts, it brings the data into everyday policy issues, into everyday life issues. So that parents who are now, for example, being told that they can go back to work under level 3 can actually also have the ability to send their kids somewhere safe during the day. And preschools are, for me, as long as they comply with all the guidelines, a safe place. Because again, the data and the facts matter on these issues. So those are the issues that made me talk and made me think this week. I'm going to go to a quick ad break. After my break, as I mentioned, I have Mr. Terence Corrigan from the Institute of Race Relations. We chat EWC and we chat property rights with Terence. We'll see you after these short messages. We're going to have a conversation with Terence Corrigan from the IRR, as I said. And the issue is EWC. That's expropriation without compensation. An issue which I think fell on the back burner a little bit because of our preoccupation with the COVID-19 pandemic and all the issues around the lockdown. But it's such a serious issue because it speaks to the future of the country and how we relate as citizens to our ability to say that we own something, that we have property rights over things. And remember, the Section 25 of the Constitution defines property very broadly. It isn't just an issue of land. The very radio that you're listening to me on is your property. The car you're sitting in, the home you have is property. The wallet in your pocket right now is property. And essentially, expropriation without compensation gives, or would likely give, a politician the ability to confiscate that from you and not have to compensate you for it. But again, don't take it from me. Let me hear from my guest himself. Terence, good morning. You're on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. Are you with us? Good morning.
Good morning, Zweli. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Terence, welcome to the show. Terence, we've been having this conversation, and I want us to jump straight into it over the next sort of 20 minutes or so. We've been having this conversation on the BDL show for quite a while about the dangers of essentially politicians giving themselves more powers to be able to pick winners and losers in a society, and often doing so with powers that give them arbitrary means to do that. EWC, Terence, for those who maybe are uninitiated on it, what is expropriation without compensation?
Well, look, expropriation happens pretty much in every society. There are times when government may need to build a road or whatever, and it essentially takes over some private asset. Or technically, it's a bit more complicated in law, but to take over a public asset from, let's say, another government department. Now, as I say, that it's not something I like, but it is a reality in modern societies. The question, though, is that if there is some sort of public good that must be achieved, it is not just for one person to bear the costs of that. Expropriation without compensation wants to turn that arrangement on its head and say, well, the government wants to set up a new system, a new system of law in which your property may be seized without you receiving anything for it. This has been going on in the background for at least a decade, and I would say actually going back into the 1990s. What makes this what has raised the temperature on it has been since 2017. This has been the explicit, written, unadulterated position of the African National Congress. They passed it in the Nasrec conference, and it's been phrased in a language of land reform. But I assure you that when you introduce a change to the system of property holding, it is not going to be limited to land. And something that I think has been very deliberately put out is the idea that this is about rural, unused farms, somewhere in the Northern Cape. Don't worry about it. Nothing to see here. Move on, folks. My question, whenever someone has confidently asserted this, I said, well, just think about this rationally. What is more worth having? A derelict property in a semi-desert region of the country, or a block of prime real estate in the middle of Sandton? All of a sudden, the mental calculus starts to change. Something that has also been put about, and I've spoken to people both in South Africa and abroad. Well, South Africa has a very strong constitution and a strong legal system, so surely whatever happens, it can't be too much of a problem. And in fact, President Ramaphosa has repeatedly said it'll be done within the constitution and the law. But what this current drive is about is changing the constitution. In other words, it's like taking a game of Monopoly and you change a fundamental rule, saying, well, you don't need money to acquire Jan Smuts Avenue. Now you could see that pretty much fundamentally changes the terms of playing that game, and this would do likewise. It would remove the large swathes of the possibility of a constitutional challenge. Now, this isn't the end of the story. We also look at a new expropriation bill, which would change, let's say, the technical mechanics of it. But on the constitutional thing, for a long time it was put forward that this is about making explicit what is implicit, because you could argue that the Constitution already under certain circumstances would allow for a zero compensation taking. But what the ANC has been talking about since the beginning of this year, just before the pandemic struck, was that they wanted the Constitution change. Now, remember, as I said, I just want to emphasize this is the big rule book. They want that change to shift the responsibility for expropriation from the courts, where you can appear with your lawyer and whatever and fight it, to the executive. In other words, they want to fundamentally change the way the rules are structured. So this will, not only change the sort of basis of a legal challenge, but they want to remove a lot of it from the legal system entirely. Be very, very afraid of what comes from that.
Absolutely, I think for a lot of people, we now fully maybe understand, including maybe those who didn't before, the dangers of allowing politicians to give themselves powers that are almost unchecked. For instance, the lockdown is a good example of that, where we saw as South Africans what life under political rule to a large extent can look like. And it wasn't pleasant. It wasn't pleasant to feel as though you have no recourse against a decision being made by an executive, which may seemingly be drunk on power. But Terence, you make such an important observation in this piece that you actually wrote this week on this particular issue, which is, questions of the security of property are being raised by the idea of politicians who already have a track record of having tried to introduce dozens of attempts, you mentioned, to encroach on private property rights. Do you want to maybe quickly talk to us about that?
Yeah, look, when I say that this is something that we're talking about having a decade-long pedigree, you can go back to to around 2007, when you started to see a concerted vilification of the idea of willing buyer, willing seller. Now, let me just point out that I would question whether this willing buyer, willing seller thing ever really existed. I think it's not codified in law anywhere. It was a phrase that the government started to use, and I think the reason to framing it like that was to say, well, we are, nice willing buyers, but it's these willing sellers who are trying to screw us. But that is a useful starting point. What you saw then was that the government started to change the conditions in which it was conducting land reform or land redistribution. Now, just a bit of background there. This is where, let's say, I'm an aspiring black farmer. I have no historical claim to a particular piece of land, but I want to get into the economy. So this was a program that was designed to kind of affect those shifts into and to get aspirant farmers into the economy. And I just want to say, I think this is a very, very, very important and potentially very, very lucrative program for the country as a whole. But what they did was that they started to they changed the conditions on which beneficiaries received this land. It stopped being given as ownership and started to be on the basis of tenancy. So that's the state, was retaining ownership, and the consequences of that, I think, have been disastrous. There's been quite a lot of research done on what some of these projects look like. You see, you have a bureaucrat who oversees this. Now, he probably has no experience in farming himself. A family gets a plot of land, but your bureaucrat is kind of held responsible if that project goes belly up. So they're not inclined even to sign a lease. So they'll sign sort of caretaker agreements, which make it illegal to do anything. You can't repair your house. You can't repair the fencing on the land.
Sure.
And as for ownership, no, it's just not going to happen. Then you had the green paper in 2011, and this was very, very meaningful because it spelt out these sort of the state-centric nature. In fact, it said that the state would kind of, as an incentive, allow substantial commercial operators to buy the land that they leased after they'd worked it to the satisfaction of your bureaucrat for 50 years. So in other words, you get it when you're 20, and the glorious day of your 70th birthday, you can go in and make an offer. Now
That's
they've
crazy.
changed those. Absolutely insane. Now they've changed those periods slightly, but everything was sort of built around this. A Pretoria will provide, or Pretoria will monitor. Big brother is watching you. And I don't know. Maybe if we had a Swedish or a Taiwanese bureaucracy, this would work. But we don't. We kind of have the bureaucracy we have.
We're trying to police open-toe shoes, and in this country. But
No, absolutely. You see, and I think what we're looking at here is a situation in which ideology has just overwhelmed pragmatism, with a good dollop of incompetence thrown in. There are some very good examples of land reform around the world in the 20th century. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, very, very good examples. What each of those did, though, was they transferred ownership.
That's right.
To your small farmer. It was also largely a case of you had people who were already working like as tenants, and they made them owners. So it was essentially incentivizing the work they were already doing. In South Africa, we have a problem with that because for various reasons, and it's a very tragic history, a lot of that peasantry was destroyed. There were attempts to kind of distribute farms to farm workers, which is a very, very mixed record. There have been some successful cases, but generally speaking, what you're talking about there are people with an agricultural background, with a high degree of trust amongst themselves, and they actually get to own the piece of land that they're working on. And this just doesn't fit the ideological script. So, what I fear is likely to happen is that if this goes through, if this does become a thing, as the current linguistic terminology puts it, we'll end up with a situation where essentially you destroy what exists of much of the agricultural economy. You drive a lot of those skills out. You are not. There simply is no support to bring in new people, even those who are enthusiastic, and they can't make a go of it anyway because they're essentially farming as civil servants under a bureaucratic class that has no clue what it's doing.
Absolutely. And
Terence,
let me quickly interject here because we've only got about 3 minutes before the ad break.
Yeah, sure.
I will have you on afterwards again for the last 10 minutes of our chats. But there's something you raised in this piece which is critically important, and it almost juxtaposes against what you've just said now. The idea that we're not. The intentions of a lot of the policy and the assault really on Section 25 of the Constitution by the political elites, if I can phrase it that way, is not to accord people ownership, but really to make them, in a sense, a serf or a tenant on the land.
Yes.
Now, juxtapose this with this wave of sentiment where people say, oh no, they'll say, President Ramaphosa is from the business community. He understands, assumingly, the value of ownership and giving people, the ability to form a business, in this case, using land. Yet you make the case that no, actually, Ramaphosa isn't your knight in shining armor in this regard, is he?
No, look, I think that first of all, to put too much faith in one person is always a mistake, irrespective of what he may personally think. He's one person in a system. Secondly, coming out of business, his business career, I would say, was mediated very much by his political connections. I don't say that is condemnation, but I don't see in President Ramaphosa an entrepreneur. And the third thing, and I think this goes for every business person who's gone into politics, whether it's Donald Trump or Herman Mashaba, the incentives functioning of business and the incentives in politics are very different. And I would say that for President Ramaphosa, his big incentive is about keeping his party together. And this is a party decision. I think we have to keep that very much in mind.
Absolutely, Terence. I'm going to have to go to our break, but after the break, I'm going to ask you 3 distinct questions, including then what the IRR proposes as being the ideal for actually, achieving the goal of land reform and really strengthening property rights in the country.
Yes.
So after the break, I continue my conversation with Terence Corrigan, the project manager at the Institute of Race Relations. Welcome back to the Big Daddy Liberty Show. I am in conversation with Terence Corrigan from the Institute of Race Relations. He's the project manager there, and really someone who, if you are a reader of the Daily Friend, you are very well accustomed, if that's the word, you're aware of, because he's actually quite a very prominent voice on the Daily Friend, and I encourage you guys to read the Daily Friend. That's dailyfriend.co.za. Terence, I have a little bit of exasperation in my voice because you make the point almost time and time again in this piece that really there is a slight, if I can characterize it this way, there's a little bit of a sleight of hand here, because the politicians will come out and say things like, we take land reform seriously. We're looking to give the land back to the people, they'll often say. But the existing, and this is a quote from your piece, the existing draft defines expropriation as the state taking ownership, not merely depriving people of their assets. They don't really say that part out, do they? Including the EFF, by the way, that actually they're looking to confiscate the land in order to put it into the hands of the state, and then you coming hat in hand as the citizen to beg the state, for a bit of land to eke out an existence on. We don't really hear that part from the politicians, do we?
No, because that would complicate the it's a historical and moralistic narrative. First thing I can say is that there's quite a lot of polling evidence on this. South Africans are, actually like the idea of property. And I remember, when my career started in the 1990s, speaking to an African gentleman who was a veteran of the '76 uprising, and we were talking about communism, and he said to me, Africans are not natural communists because we have always owned property. He says, if you want to see it, look at cattle. So that's that predated the arrival of white people or European systems. And I think the same goes for for land, at least now. Perhaps in a bygone age when it was very sparsely populated, ownership of land was a less intense thing. But no, what we are seeing here is an attempt by the state to empower itself. Now, there are some, I think, some in the ANC who I think are motivated by, let's say, a drive to introduce a kind of communist people's democracy, and there are others who see this as the sort of mighty Asian developmental state. Neither are particularly popular even amongst the ANC, or for that matter, the EFF support base. People generally want to own what they live on. But if once you do that, you start to create individual sovereignty, the conditions for individual autonomy, and it becomes a lot more difficult to use this for patronage.
That's right.
And that's very important. But even if if this was going to further some sort of, as I say, developmental state agenda, you would need a developmental state capable of doing that, which we just don't have. Forget it; it doesn't exist. And until the ANC changes a course like literally 180 degrees, there's no possibility of that existing. So it's quite laughable. There's been a case that reached the courts last year and was resolved just actually a few weeks ago. A guy by the name of David Rachase, in Limpopo, right? Now this is a guy who should be a poster boy for successful land reform, or successful black agriculture. He was. He acquired a piece of land from the old Mapudetswana government in the early 90s and built quite a successful livestock farming endeavor on it. In about 2002, I think he said he wanted to buy it. The government at the time was selling and agreed. But the wheels turned slowly. I mean, here are the weaknesses of our state. And basically, he didn't. They came back to him in sort of 2011 and said, "Oh no, we've changed our mind. You can't have it. You can have this sort of long-term lease, which turned out to be 5 years, and then it was like 1 month by month." And his farm was actually invaded by a group of people. He reckons that there was some sort of collusion going on behind the scenes. And he tried to have them evicted, but that was thrown out because he didn't have locus standi in the matter. He wasn't the owner. The state prevaricated for 2 years and then eventually went to court. So I understand he still has this problem. When it went to court, the decision was absolutely scathing, and they made this point. The government talks this game about land reform and whatever. There's a lot of historical pain behind it. Yet here you have a guy who's ticked every box, and has done it successfully, and you're saying, well, no. Anyway, it was very, very enlightening what the government's papers in this case said, that it is their policy that, quote, black farming households and communities should not have ownership, but have long-term leases.
That's crazy.
Now, yeah. And I mean, this didn't come out of the RV beer or anything. This comes out of the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform.
That's crazy.
It's I don't know. Words fail me, and they seldom do.
Absolutely. And I mean, Tara, I must interject because we're in our last 3 minutes, really, and right. I want us to get into You've set the case out quite aptly, I think, around the dangers of this. And you even gave us this example of David Rachase, who I'm hoping to have on the Big Daddy Liberty show to show viewers this story. But You guys have been an
Right.
important voice in actually saying there are preferable ways of achieving land reform, strengthening property rights. Can you just maybe your top 5 or just top 3 interventions on how we can get this right according to the IRR?
Right. We need to shift the focus from land as a kind of historical or political issue to farming. Now, this is particularly about rural land reform. Urban land reform slightly different, but that's the big conceptual shift. We need to make it possible for aspiring farmers to get onto their land and to become owners. I think, where you have customary tenure, that's also a bit more difficult, and I think there's intermediate steps you might have to go through. But we need to start taking the creation of commercial farming seriously. A small to medium scale with like sky's the limit expansion ideas. Encourage the ambition. We need post-settlement support, which is I don't think the government is capable of providing it. But I think funding for a proper extension service, possibly managed by someone like Agri-SA, would be a good idea. And there has to be a very, very strict approach towards land invasions and the violation of property rights, because this is something that someone like David Mkhize had to face, and we've seen this actually with a lot of land reform programs. You get a community or a group of people who take some sort of ownership or residence, and they find that there's a rival group that shows up, and it often just comes down to who's pointing the bigger guns. We need to retain law and order very firmly.
Absolutely.
And finally, and equally important, rural infrastructure. We need the roads and the water supplies and whatever to make that possible.
Absolutely. Terence, thank you so much. Super appreciate that. Terence, of course, you can find his writing, analysis and opinion on the Daily Friend website. That's dailyfriend.co.za. Terence, just very briefly before you go, there's actually a comment that we got here from D, who says, this sounds exactly like the beginning of the Soviet Union, and then they all starved. That's a comment from D, which again underpins the point you're making, that there's an ideology being driven behind all of this.
Yeah.
But Terence, I must say thank you to you. And after the break, I do what I do on the show all the time, which is to tell you who the MOEMISH of the week is this week. All right, guys, we're in the final few minutes of the show, and as usual, I look at the news week ahead very briefly, what I think will be an issue that I tackle going forward, and of course, who the MOEMISH of the week is. But let me begin here. There's 2 distinct issues that I think I'm going to be keeping an eye on. Number one is the growing furor, if I can call it that, stemming from the press conference held by Cricket South Africa, where one of their players, Lungi Lingidi, a star fast bowler in the team, basically argued, that the team should owe some sort of fealty to the Black Lives Matter movement, taking his cue, of course, from the game he watched in England between the English and I think the West Indies, who were donning, I think some sort of branding, Black Lives Matter branding on them, and they did a whole, dog and pony show of, taking a knee and all that stuff. There's a conversation to be had around this, because I've always said that there is a very big difference between stating rightly that you believe that black people's lives matter, indeed all people's lives matter, versus saying you support the Black Lives Matter movement, which if you actually look at who they really are, their stated objectives, they stand firmly against things like the values that I stand for instance, which are of faith, love of flag, love of country, that is, and family. They stand firmly opposed to these principles, and it's something we need to keep an eye on, because it's playing itself out in the politics today, where essentially you have these mobs of self-righteous, self-appointed language and thought police who hide behind these movements like Black Lives Matter in order to police dissent and to police free speech in a society. So this is something I need to say I'll be keeping an eye on, and I'll probably do a show on the Big Daddy Liberty show. That's the one you can find find on YouTube and Facebook this week as I look at this issue and really unpack what Black Lives Matter, the organization, really is versus people who actually believe rightly that Black people's lives, indeed all lives, matter. So you can look forward to that on the Big Daddy Liberty Show this week as we tackle this issue of essentially race nationalism that is being shrouded as, these progressive movements, where it's actually ethnic nationalism that's being punted. Another one we need to keep an eye on, or rather, no, let me get to the interesting bits. Who is the MOEMISH of the week? This one I think is well deserved, which is a bit sad because this person's actually done relatively well in terms of responding to COVID-19. But I'm sorry, in this instance, he deserves the title of MOEMISH of the week. I'm talking, of course, about the National Minister of Health in this country, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, including, of course, his Eastern Cape counterpart, who this week he's actually backpedaled on what was initially his support of this 10 million rand scooter project. And really, he's right to backpedal on it, but he must take the egg on his face, because even at the time when he was celebrating this as wonderful and look at how the Eastern Cape government is innovating, people were asking him the questions: how practical really and how legal really is it to expect someone, who may be dying of an illness, very sick and poor, why are we subjecting them to essentially the indignity of riding shotgun on a scooter when we have the kind of money to be able to fund and provide proper ambulances and proper skilled EMS personnel to look after and care for poor people in this country? Which begs the question, really, is it not time that we have a conversation around the desperately needed reform in healthcare provision in this country, placing more of the power, placing more of the resources into the hands of poorer people so that they can make their own decisions around how they access quality healthcare? So that's unfortunately something that saw Dr. Zweli Mkhize, for me, taking the mantle of the MOEMISH of the week. What was he thinking? Oh my goodness. And with that being said, thank you so much for listening to the Big Daddy Liberty Show, the podcast, which of course is syndicated right here on Chai FM. Hopefully it'll be on more radio stations across the country. Remember, you can follow me on all my social media. That's Big Daddy Liberty on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can watch the Big Daddy Liberty Show every Wednesday, or Blacks Only every Wednesday, that alternates on the Big Daddy Liberty Show, the YouTube page, at 8 p.m. And of course, on Sundays, you have Late Nights with Big Daddy Liberty at 9 p.m. So thank you very much to you for listening, and thank you to the production team at Chai for helping put together the show. My name is Big Daddy Liberty. I will see you next week, Friday, on the Big Daddy Liberty Show.
Chai FM, your station of choice.